the jihadi movement today with Al-Qaeda, with Islamic State, really starts in Afghanistan around the end of 1979 when Russia, the Soviet Union, invades. And the message to volunteers, it's very clear. It's raising money is not enough. We need people to come fight. And you had some Arab activists who had been very supportive of this theory that Muslims around the world needed to get involved, needed to fight back, take back land that was being taken from them. And so some of them were there at the beginning. They showed up almost immediately to say that it doesn't matter if they're a different ethnic group, if we're Arab and they're Afghan, they're fellow Muslims, no one is helping them. We have to stop these communists from destroying their lands. And this went actually on for the first half of the 1980s without a lot of success. It wasn't really until Osama bin Laden came with all of his money and began getting support in Saudi Arabia to fly people out on paid trips to make jihad that you started to get larger numbers. But even so, it was only a couple of hundred people. The Soviets didn't even know they were there. But they were convinced that they had defeated the Soviet Red Army. They were convinced that the Soviet Union collapsed because of them. And so when the war ended, a lot of them knew that because they had been involved in terrorism back in their Arab home countries, they were not going to be welcomed back. The idea was they were supposed to have been killed in Afghanistan, but they weren't. They survived. And they had nowhere to go. They were told they couldn't stay anymore. So they started to look for other places. And they looked for other wars, like Afghanistan. Maybe there were communist armies or there were Muslim civilians. And so they went to different places, like Chechnya, to the Philippines, to Algeria, Bosnia, all over the world. And they spread out from there, which is what I think makes the Muslim foreign fighters different than the past groups, like the Spanish Civil War, is because in the past, the groups, they just went home. The governments let them back in. In this case of Spain, the League of Nations, before the United Nations, actually gave them money and facilitated their travel back to their home countries. So you had this sort of semi-professional group starting up because they had nowhere else to go. And so eventually 9/11 happens, they fight in Afghanistan for a while, but it becomes clear that Iraq is going to be the next big battleground. And many of them, knowing that the United States was going to Iraq, actually left Afghanistan to go to Iraq so they could fight the American army. And it really, they did well for a while because they made the same sort of defensive argument. They said, in this case, that they were Sunni, that Iraq Muslims, that Iraq was being taken over by Shia Muslims, who were the majority in Iraq, but had Saddam Hussein, the previous dictator, had been Sunni. So now they said, we're here to defend Sunnis. Most of their targets were actually Shia Muslims in Iraq, government offices like Shia police stations, Shia mosques. And they did quite well for a while because they had a lot of disaffected people who were losing things under the new government in Iraq with them. But they made the same sort of rhetoric also that innocent people are being killed, that if you're a good Muslim, you have to fight back because nobody else is going to. It's been the same story. And they didn't have to start from the beginning because people had already been hearing the story for years because of previous activists who were still involved. So the Islamic State, they did very well for a few years in Iraq. Ultimately, the local population turned against them and began working with the US military to hunt them down. So there was quite a while where their fortunes were down before the conflict in Syria started. And in Syria, it was the same narrative. We're defending Sunni Muslims against the Shia Assad government. And this was the case where, because of Russian support for Assad, the international forces were not going to go. So they actually knew that they had an open place to operate where they could found their caliphate that went along with their plans for a number of years.
Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net.